Bartow, Florida. And Bartow, Florida, where he was raised, was a very interesting town, and it had a very dynamic and vibrant middle class, black middle class, of which his father and other relatives were central in promoting. But his grandparents were very key in the evolution of the AME in Florida, and they were politicians in Reconstruction Florida. So he comes with a certain kind of pedigree that not everybody had growing up at that time. He's one of 10. His parents were highly cultured. One of his sisters was named after Lillian Nordica, who was, I discovered, the most prominent opera singer of the age, and her name was Nordica. And he was one of 10, he was the oldest, and all 10 of them went on to college. One became he became a doctor, there was a dentist, a minister who became an educator, 2 nurses, school teachers, a nurse, a midwife, and I think I may have forgotten one. But so the family really had aspirations. And so here was the son of basically a woodcutter. He sold wood, which was how people heated their houses, and an orange tree farmer. So anyway, so he comes from that background, and his father insists that he go to Wilberforce. He is going to college right in the midst of this tension between what kind of education this generation, who's born in the 1890s, and by the way, his birthday is this week, and the trial commenced on October 30th. So we're right in the midst of celebrating these anniversaries. His father insisted that he go to Wilberforce, which was a very intellectually driven school promoting the talents that W.E.B. Du Bois taught there as a young man before he moved on. And the tension between a place like Wilberforce and the Booker T. Washington industrial education was raging at that time. And his father insisted that they all have liberal arts educations, and that from that they would earn and they would they would grow into the talented 10. So that's another place where his life intersects the history of the period through which he grows. He grows up at a period in time when lynchings in the South probably reached their apex in the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century. And a town not far from him, Mulberry, has what's called this hanging tree. And you could see it on the train, and Mulberry was the next train stop after Bartow. And every time he went to Lakeland, everybody had to pass the hanging tree. So lynchings, and a lynching that he saw when he was 7 years old, informed a lot of his apprehension about crowds, about mobs, about violence, and what could be reasonable to assume and what could be, entirely fearful. So there was the lynching that he saw when he was 7. There was the hanging tree outside of Mulberry. It wasn't just hanging; it was full of bullets. When he was in Washington as a medical student, he was in the midst of the riots during World War I in the streets of Washington. So here was somebody who saw firsthand what violence, interracial violence, or anti-racial violence could do, and it left a lasting impression, and one that he talks about in his trial, and that Clarence Darrow then uses as an explanation of the psychology of fear with which he viewed this crowd amassing outside of his house for 2 consecutive nights. Once again, this is a real intersection of history, and it plays a significant role in the NAACP, and I'm going to mention that in a minute, but before I do, I want to say that another part of where he intersects, where he carries history's narrative, is in his coming to Detroit. So he's a college student at Wilberforce, and in the summers he comes to Detroit, as do many college students, and he works on the, he has 4 different summer jobs. One is at a hotel where he's a porter, and another is on the coast, on the shore, where he's working on one of the boats that go out to, I guess, evening cruises. So he comes during these summers and he stays with other Wilberforce alums. And so he develops an affection for Detroit, and then he becomes part of that Wilberforce alumni group that settles here. And there's fraternity fellows, and there's a real culture here, a supportive culture, a nurturing culture, one that makes it easy for somebody like Ossian Sweet, who very much has aspirations to be a pivotal figure in the black middle class. It's very easy, especially in a segregated city like Detroit, to establish those roots. And as a physician and as a pharmacist, and at that time in the 1920s, oftentimes physicians did compound medicines that they sold, and he did that. So he was part of the Southern exodus, although because he was part of the professional class, he was not, it was very different than the people who were really escaping the South at that time, escaping the violence of it, escaping the hardships, escaping the lack of opportunities, and coming up on the trains and unfortunately settling in, or they were happy to be leaving. They went to Pittsburgh and Chicago and Detroit and a little bit of New York, but more Newark. But the housing stock that they were forced into was really so unsatisfactory. It was decrepit. It was insulting. That you had tens of people sometimes sharing beds, renting beds while other people were working. So you could have an apartment where 5, 10, 15. I think the highest number I found were 19 people sharing an apartment because they were just kind of on a three shift rotation. And this became a very important point for the Urban League. And John Dancy is a Detroiter, and the Urban League is strong in Detroit. And this becomes a very strong part of their mission. Their reform mission is to improve housing, to get rid of this decrepit housing that people coming up from the sharecroppers coming up from the South are forced into. And some are able to leave. People like Ossian Sweet, of course, had different expectations, and there were different practices, and I'll get into them in a second, of using the black middle class to not desegregate housing, not create open housing, but to isolate people by allowing sellers, by a deal that realtors had of selling one or two houses on a block to a black family as a way, and stopping there, as a way of discouraging a vibrant community of the black middle class, which Detroit was definitely growing at that time, with doctors and lawyers and dentists, and Ossian Sweet's own brother was a dentist. So in that housing segregation style, and then the case that's later brought, you see once again, Ossian Sweet as emblematic of this larger cultural phenomenon. But housing at that time in the 20s was a major problem nationwide, and there were many cases being fought by the NAACP. And the NAACP at this point in time is led by James Weldon Johnson. And James Weldon Johnson has already been an ambassador to Nicaragua and Venezuela. He's already established himself as a very prominent musician, with his brother having written many things for Broadway, many songs, including, I think, that his signature piece is the Negro National Anthem, right? And so James Weldon Johnson, who also is from Florida, whose family probably intersected with the Ossian Sweet family because they lived in this pretty ghettoized part of Jacksonville, and they were growing up together. He is the he's the president of the NAACP in 1925 when the riot outside of Ossian Sweet's house occurs, attempting to stone him out of his house. And he takes the case, but it is one of several cases that the NAACP is handling at that time. There, in 1917, and here I'm going to refer to my notes, there had been a Supreme Court case which had, people were, I think, optimistic about its effect on eliminating segregation as a barrier to housing. But at the time, there were, wait, I have it down here.